And as you can see here, below ground resprouting is very important in different ecosystems all over the world. And when we are talking about humid ecosystems, it makes a lot of importance. And our savannas in Brazil are mesic, so we are talking about these systems. So, and we know that in savannas in Brazil, most of plants are resprouting from either basal buds or below ground buds. This is a study made after a huge wildfire where Giselda works. So you're going to listen a little bit about it. And after this wildfire, so as you know, it's very difficult to kill a shrub and a savanna tree because at least in Brazil, they're going to resprout from the base. And here the base means base and underground organs. And here is from a open savanna and showing you that this is the most important post-fire regeneration strategy. So Mariska already showed this picture. It was a good introduction, but just to talk a little bit about the regeneration. So we have fire consumes almost all above ground biomass. In our case, in our savannas, it will consume between 85 to 95% of the above ground biomass. And the regeneration will be by resprouting from these below-ground buds. And occasionally, and this is the case of the Cerrado, most of the plants will flower. So if you want to visit the Cerrado, I advise you to visit after a wildfire or after a prescribed burning, because you're going to see almost everything flower in our system, because this is what happens. And then these plants will stand there, biomass will accumulate, mostly attached to the plant, waiting for the next fire to come. But how do we study this? Well, you have to get your hands dirty and dig. There is no other way to really understand what is happening below ground, to understand where and how these structures are. And if you have clonal plants like this one, this is a plant with a woody rhizome, or if it's only a non-clonal plant. So you really have to dig sometimes, take the plant with you to the lab, depending on what you want to see. So I think the main message is that when we are studying tropical open ecosystems, trying to understand response to fire, we are missing a great part of the story, because we are looking only at what is happening above ground. And this is not only true for tropical savannas, it's also true for other ecosystems in the world. But when we are talking about savannas, we know that more biomass is found below ground than above ground. So if we don't understand what is happening below ground, it's very difficult to explain some of the patterns we see above ground as well. So this is, for example, an underground tree that in the forest is a big tree, but in the species in the Cerrado which has not a corky bark, has all the stems protected below ground. It's a huge underground tree, and you only see the leaves, flowers, and the fruits above ground. So Cerrado is very heterogeneous as different tropical savannas in the world, and we have different physiognomies related to the woody cover, and what we know is that the more frequent fires are, the more open they are, the more biomass is then hidden in the soil, and that we have to take a look at this. So I will talk more about the below-ground structures, but I will just give you an overview about the roots, because yesterday we talked a lot about roots. So these are two open savannas that Swazig took a look at the root biomass. So just to characterize the vegetation, how much above ground biomass we have, and if we just look at this, we miss all this biomass below ground. So there is a lot of fine roots, but also a lot of coarse roots in the system. So she digged until 1 meter deep, so it's all the root biomass accumulated in 1 meter profile. And we also know that the more frequent fires are in the area, the more root biomass we have. And this is mostly related to the fine roots, which just after fire, increase in their biomass, mostly in the upper parts of the soil, the first 30 centimeters. And the longer fire is excluded, we lose some of this biomass of roots in the areas. But we also have in the tropical open ecosystem these amazing below-ground organs that we are not paying attention. And they are responsible not only for carrying buds, but also for having carbon, storing carbon, since we talked so much about carbon before lunch. So you can see that there are different types of these below-ground organs. It's not restricted to one family, so we just did analyze and submit the paper that we show that most of the described below-ground organs in the Cerrado are from Fabaceae and Asteraceae, but this is biased because most of the people working with Fabaceae and Asteraceae were describing this structure. So we have to dig more in other families. So it's not restricted to one family, it's not restricted to shrubs or trees, so have lots of forbs with these structures. And this is one in particular, very interesting, the Chilopodium, which is mostly related to the function is to bear the buds and below ground, and then so they be able to resprout after fire. But some of these structures, like this woody rhizome, they are also clonal plants. So it's really important to know if you have in your system clonal plants, if they are only resprouting, or if with fire or any other disturbance like herbivory, you're promoting clonality. So plants are just walking and moving. So when we study below-ground storage organs, we usually look at some traits, and one of these is the type of the below-ground organ. The other one is the bud bank size. It means how many buds we have there that can potentially become a new shoot. And another important thing is what type of storage we have, and we can do this very easily with anatomy. You don't have even to do chemical analysis to know that. So here is just to show you the variety of below-ground organs that we can find in tropical ecosystems. So I just pointed out some of them. So lignotubers, they are more common in Mediterranean ecosystems. They bear a lot of buds. They are also non-clonal, have starch. Chilopodium I was told you about, mostly non-clonal. Mostly they don't have starch, but fructans. And we also have some that are clonal, like these fleshy rhizomes that are usually found in forbs and grasses. So we know there is a relationship of diversity, density of these below-ground organs to fire. So at least in Brazil, in the Cerrado, we know that the higher the fire frequency, the more diversity and density of these below-ground organs we're going to find in the system. And this is really related to resilience of the system. Since all plants are resprouting, we need these organs to keep these ecosystems working. So, and we also know that the difference in the type of the organ we have, so we know that Chilopodium, for example, completely disappear from the system, and it's a woody structure, if we don't burn the system for a long time. So all these species with this structure will disappear from the system, will not be able to resprout after fire. So Chilopodium can be found mostly in these tropical grassy ecosystems. And we have different forms of this Chilopodium. It can be like a globe, and it can be attached to a tuberous taproot, or it can be like very small, like here, or it can be like elongated. So there are different forms. It will depend on soil and other things. And when we published this paper, we really wanted to emphasize that, to know that we are really restoring tropical open ecosystem. We have to be assured the resilience, and the resilience is really related to the presence of the viable bud bank. So not only, just to finish my talk, not only about bud bank, but also about carbon. So carbon we talked a lot about this, so I will not take long talking about this, but we know that most of this carbon will be stored in this below-ground biomass, roots, and the structure. So it's really important to take a look at them. So when you are in the field and you see something resprouting, make this question, ask this question, where do these shoots come from? And then just go ahead and dig it. And maybe you're gonna be surprised what you're gonna find. And that's what, I think that is my take-home message for you. And just to finish my talk, I just wanted to tell you that we have now this S Underfoot project. We are trying to understand, unify ecological concepts, not only looking at roots and leaves, but also trying to link clonality of plants and bud banks. So if you have data and want to talk about root and below ground traits, just come to me or to Yitka and we'll be glad to talk to you. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Alessandra.
Thank you.
Kept your time very well.
Yeah.
Thank you. Okay, there's unfortunately no time for questions, but we will give Catherine and Gia some time to give us evidence of the smoke-induced nutrient translocation in whistling thorns.
Hello. This will be a brief interruption of the Brazilian session to talk about Kenya, so sorry about that. But it will be about resprouting, at least. So yes, I have this fancy title, but basically we're asking if there's some really short-term responses that plants might be doing before they get burned down, because we talk a lot about how they can resprout after they burn down, but we've been collecting evidence that actually the plant kind of might know that it's going to be burnt down and try and do something about that, even though it can't run away. So yeah, I don't really have to justify to you guys that acacias are important because you could just go outside and look around. But the focal species that this work is addressing is Acacia drepanalobium. And in the very heavy clay, they're called black cotton soil savannas of East Africa, these guys really dominate. They're 90% of all tree species is this one species. And they have to be adapted to numerous threats. So we've talked a lot about fire. They can resprout after being completely top-killed because their roots survive. And they also have to deal with a variety of browsers in the savanna. But toward this end, they have a really interesting mutualism that they've developed with ants. This has been very well studied. I won't get into it today. But basically, the ant colonies live on the plants themselves in these specialized structures and bite things that try and eat the tree. But the reason this is relevant is that it was noticed that from kilometers away, the smoke from fires would drift over and the ants would start panicking, they would run around, and sometimes even evacuate the tree to hide in the soil. So this led us to ask, is the tree trying to do something similar? This is not as crazy as it sounds, because trees have been known to respond to a wide range of volatile cues like smoke, and they can do this relatively quickly, like within the order of a few days is usually what's measured, and this is a good review if you're interested in more. But smoke in particular has been studied as a germination cue in a lot of plants, including some that aren't even fire adapted, which is really interesting, but not a lot of work has been done on smoke as a volatile cue for responses in adult plants. So the original research that we did to explore this was just in a greenhouse in Cambridge, and we had a bunch of potted Acacia drepanalobium and exposed them to smoke with like the same kind of thing that you smoke meat with. And then after a day, we broke them down and did a nutrient analysis and found something really interesting, which is that the tissues were very different in their nutrient content in the smoke-exposed group compared to the one that hadn't been exposed. And this was after just 24 hours. So the colors are not showing up here, but these guys are the smoke-exposed. And the roots had a lot more nitrogen, and the leaves had a lot less nitrogen than the control groups, which is sort of suggestive of maybe some nutrient translocation happening from the stuff that's going to get burned, maybe, to the place where it's protected. So we decided to follow up with this in some field experiments, which had a lot of differences to them. We had a bunch of potted Acacia drepanalobium in Impala Research Center in Kenya, and they're planted in the actual clay soil where they would grow, and there's other benefits to doing things more realistically. But we also did this with trees that were actually growing out in the fields. And another benefit of this experiment is we collected before and after smoke exposure for all the trees, so it was a paired experiment this time. So thanks to our collaborator, Patrick Milligan, we saw that just 6 hours after smoke exposure, there was evidence of stomatal closure in these plants, which reduced their transpiration and photosynthetic rates. So clearly they were not happy about getting smoked. But the nutrient results were not quite the same as what we'd seen before. In the potted plants, there was no change in the leaf nitrogen. Maybe this is a benefit of like having a good paired experiment, but we did see an increase in root nitrogen, which is strange and maybe suggests root uptake has increased or fixation. But then, comparing over here is this one you saw before, comparing that to the field trees, we actually saw a complete opposite response in the leaves, where the ones that were exposed to smoke actually showed an increase in their nitrogen. And this is not probably due to like ash deposition or anything, because all of these were placed in exposure to the smoke from ongoing fires, which, by the way, are thanks to experiments that Impala was doing. So we're really trying to figure this out. I am hoping that a plant physiologist here will come talk to me afterwards and give me some ideas, because I am actually a bug person. But I got sidetracked because this is cool. And one of the things we're thinking of is that it was a drought in Kenya when we were working, but we treated our potted plants very well. So there might be some differences in nutrient behavior because of differences in watering or the soil that they were potted in. It might have to do with the fact that the field trees were of unknown ages and had deeper root systems. And it might have to do with the fact that our potted plants were not exposed to any sort of herbivory and didn't have ants. So again, please come tell me if any of these ideas seem more plausible than the others so that we can have better follow-up experiments. So I'd like to thank all of my co-authors, collaborators, and everybody at Impala that was really helpful with this experiment. Thank you.
Thank you, Catherine. All right, so we're going to move straight on to our next presenter, who's Yanni Stein. And she's going to give us a presentation on the effects of fire frequency on the persistence of the Savanna soil seed bank.
Okay, hello everybody. So I'm a first year's master's student at the University of the Northwest, and today I'm going to give you a little bit of feedback from the results of my honors project. The relationship between fire and savanna vegetation has been studied extensively in South Africa. We know that fire frequency affects savanna vegetation composition, structure, and function through driving the recruitment and mortality of different functional groups and species. But there is a knowledge gap regarding the effect of fire frequency on recruitment attributes such as soil seed banks. So with this study, we aimed to address some of those gaps, specifically pertaining to soil seed bank dynamics, as well as soil seed bank persistence. Our experimental design had three main components: a soil seed bank study, a species-specific germination trials, and viability tests. So for the soil seed bank study, we collected our samples here in the Kruger National Park at the Satara and Nwanetsi EBPs. We focused on 3 fire frequency treatments, annual, triennial, and fire exclusion, to see what the effect is on the soil seed bank persistence and composition. And we executed this through germination trials in a greenhouse back at the university. Then we also collected seeds from the most dominant grass and forb species that were present in the different fire treatments, and we conducted germination trials on those specific species. We wanted to see if the germination success was maybe influenced by the presence of dormancy characteristics. This we also executed through germination trials in a greenhouse. Then for the viability tests, we conducted viability tests on seeds from the same forb and grass species we collected for the species-specific germination trials, and this served as an additional indicator of dormancy if the species had proportion of viable seeds, but not the same proportion of germination success in the species-specific germination trials. The viability test we conducted was incubation, drying, and suspension flotation technique, as well as a tweezer test. The preliminary results indicated that for the soil seed bank study, that neither long-term fire exclusion or the presence of fire resulted in the depletion of the soil seed bank. We did, however, find that the presence or absence of fire influenced the number of seedlings that emerged from the soil seed bank, as well as the forb to grass ratio of those seedlings. For example, in the soil seed bank from the fire exclusion plot, there was a dominance of grass seedlings that emerged, whereas in the annual and triennial fire soil samples, there was an increase in the dominance of forb seedlings that emerged. For the species-specific germination trials, we had mixed results. Roughly 50% of the species germinated successfully, but the other half of the species, of which forbs were a large percentage, had trouble germinating. And we think this is an indicator of the presence of dormancy characteristics within these species. The viability test supports this hypothesis in the sense that species that had a low germination success actually had a higher proportion of viable seeds. And then in my master's project, I'm continuing this research and expanding on it with gathering a lot more soil seed bank samples. We're also extending the germination trial period. And then we're also going to include tetrazolium viability tests instead of the ones I used last year. And we're also looking to include dormancy breaking techniques such as cold exposure, heat shock, and smoke-infused water. Thank you.
Thank you, Yanni. We unfortunately don't have time for questions, but you can chat to it tonight at supper. We're going to head on back to Brazil. And Giselda Durigan is going to give us an interesting talk on how the neotropical grasslands recover over 1 year after fire.
Okay. Oh, hi, everyone. This presentation is about how the ground layer vegetation of the neotropical grassland recover over the first year after fire. It's all about all these people collecting data in 7 different sites across Brazil, in a long distance between sites, and there we have some grasslands in wet soils. We mean seasonally waterlogged soils, and the yellow ones are in dry areas. In each site, we collected 5 1-square-meter plots, data in these plots, every 2 months after fire. We were in search for the numbers in terms of how much biomass each grassland can accumulate maximum within the year, and what would be the maximum productivity in terms of grams per square meter in 1 month. We sampled ground cover, biomass, and also reproductive process separating graminoids and non-graminoids, but here in 5 minutes you see only the 2 first variables. For ground cover, we had a pattern. We found a pattern. There is a similar behavior for all these grasslands. You can see in 4 months, all of them had recovered the ground cover by live plants, and all ranging from 60 to 90% ground cover. It's like unburned grasslands. But, and no, you see no difference between dry and wet. But if it's about biomass, it's a mess because we have huge difference in terms of the maximum with these arrows. We have difference in when the maximum happens in terms of accumulated biomass. And the maximum productivity, which is the slope in these curves, is also largely different between sites. But all maximum occurs in the first months after fire. And then we try to find explanation for the difference. And then we've got climate and soil variables. Within climate, there is altitude. We have mean annual temperature, rainfall, evapotranspiration, water depth, altitude. And for soil, we have some chemical variables, pH, phosphorus, base saturation, and also soil texture that represents the soil water holding capacity. For the peak of biomass, that is the maximum that we recorded in each site within a year, ranging from 195 and 512, is not explained for any of these variables. It's almost the same for the maximum productivity in terms of grams per square meter per month, that ranged from 27 to 94 grams per square meter between these grasslands. The only variable presenting a marginally significant influence on productivity was phosphorus. Nothing else. And if you ask me, aren't these three those wet grasslands? No, they are not. So it's not about that. Our main findings can be summarized in these three. It's very quick, the recovery. In less than a year, both ground cover and biomass are stabilized, or they have a slow decrease in terms of biomass. That's quite quick for those worried about the carbon emitted when burning. And the biomass varies largely between sites. Then, we have no answer for a while what can explain, and we think that the composition, species composition of these grasslands can have a relevant influence on the biomass and the rhythm of recovery. And that's it. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Giselda. So we're going to carry on. We're going to move on to our next 15-minute presentation. Our next presenter is Hudson Fontanelli, who's going to give us some insight on how the fire-suppressed Cerrado grass community changes after 7 consecutive annual fires.
Well, hello. Hi, my name is Hudson Fontanelli. I'm a student at the State University of Campinas, Brazil. I'm a master's student, and I've been studying how the grass layer responds to fire regimes in the Cerrado. This time I'm showing you our results on how the grass layer responded to the reintroduction of fire in a fire-suppressed grassland. So let's start with some facts. Well, fire suppression is bad for the tropical open grassy ecosystems. These ecosystems have evolved and developed themselves in the presence of a disturbance regime. And particularly for the Cerrado, these ecosystems have evolved with the presence of fire. Fire suppression can result in important harmful changes to the ecosystems, such as loss of diversity, changes in the structure and functioning, and that's because during encroachment, the canopy closes due to increased woody cover, which in turn will exclude the shade-intolerant grass layer. And there lies the problem, because the shade-intolerant grass layer is where most of the diversity of these ecosystems lie. Particularly for grasses, that is very important, since grasses are highly related, remarkably related to fire regimens. So in this figure, you can see that the grass density, the grass abundance, is strongly related to frequent fire return intervals in ecosystems with fire return intervals shorter than 10 years. And grasses are particularly associated with fire since they are benefited from fire, but also benefit fire occurrence, which is the grass-fire cycle. So grasses are the main fuel load to fires in tropical open ecosystems because they have a series of traits that allow fire spread to a much better rate. In turn, they will benefit a fire occurrence, and fire will maintain the canopy open, allowing grasses to thrive in these ecosystems. And fire exclusion, you can see there in the blue figures that their cover and richness will decrease towards the closed ecosystems. Well, if grasses are very linked to fire and very related to fire occurrence, we can believe that the reintroduction of fire regimes will improve these species, but remains the question, how will the grass layer respond to fires after a long period of fire exclusion? That's because grasses, when they are fire excluded, they tend to get shorter and smaller, and they may be under a higher stressful condition, since the canopy closure does not allow biomass productivity and the replenishment of their nutrient storages. They are under the stress of shading. They are also under self-shading, and their bud banks may be reduced, as observed in the talk by Alessandra, and that may decrease their resilience and the functioning of these individuals, which may in turn not respond very well to the reintroduction of fire. So to answer this question, we sampled fire-suppressed grasslands in the southern limits of the Cerrado. These grasslands have only had a single fire event in over 3 decades, and they are under the pressure of encroachment and fire exclusion. To sample the grass layer, we established permanent plots in 3 different grasslands. They are nearby grasslands, and each plot was subdivided in 10 subplots, and within each subplot we had 4 experimental sampling units. There were 1 meter square quadrats, so in total we had 41 meter square quadrats per grassland, and in total we sampled 120 quadrats. So sampling was basically counting all of the grass individuals and identifying all of them in each of the quadrats. So you may be thinking, how did we separate each grass individual, since grasses are kind of hard to separate? Well, in the Cerrado, grasses have the cespitous growth form. They're all, in general, two-stalk grasses. So it's kind of easy to separate the little clumps of the little cluster of tillers that will form a two-stalk. We did the sampling in 2 periods, before fire introduction and after fire. So back in 2015, all plots were sampled, all individuals were counted and identified to species level, and after 7 mid-dry season fires in an annual fire regime, we did another sampling in 2022 when we recounted all of the individuals and identified all of them. So what we have is the possibility to look for changes comparing before and after, and that's how we analyzed our data. We assessed the relative change between the sampling periods using an effect size approach in which we used the log response ratio, and we had 2 main questions regarding the community and population analysis. In the community, we wanted to see how fire affected the richness, abundance, and the composition of the community, and in the population, we asked how the population size of the most frequent species was affected by the reintroduction of fire. So let's go to the results. How did the grass layer respond to the reintroduction of fire? And this may be one of the most surprising and interesting results, but the 7 consecutive fires doubled the grass density in plots, but it did not affect the richness. So what we saw was a doubling of individuals that went from 8 to 17 individuals meter square, with no change in the richness per meter square. And that's maybe one of our most interesting results, because we can see that the frequent fires actually doubled the density, even though these species were under 30 years of fire suppression. These individuals were under 30 years of fire suppression. And even though we do not have any change in the richness per quadrat, we did saw a change in the total richness. So after fires, we recorded 5 new species which colonized the plots and were only recorded in the second sampling. However, we did have 1 species that was excluded from the plots, But overall, the balance was positive, so the total richness increased from 26 to 30 species. But it remains the question, how did the species importance to the community composition change after fire? So did fire change community composition and the importance of species? And yes, it did. So what happened was that frequent fires increased the dominance of the most frequent species. In 2015, the 5 most abundant species accounted for 69% of the species, and in 2022, an 18% increase in their dominance, with these species accounting now for 87% of the total community abundance. However, when you look closer into which species are representing the community the most, we can see that there's a change that 2 species had a steep increase in their importance, but 1 species that was the 5th most important species in 2015 actually was excluded from this class, and another species actually got into the 5 most important species. So if we have 1 species that is going out, 1 species that is going in, we likely have changes in their population sizes, and that's what we look when we see how were populations affected by the frequent fires. We could find, among the 19 most frequent species, these were the species that we could have a sufficient population size to analyze it, and we could classify the species in 3 groups. So the first group, the unaffected species, well, those are the largest amount of species. We had 58%, that is 11 out of 19 species. They were not affected. They did not have significant changes in their population sizes. But within the disadvantaged species and within the benefited species, we see interesting results. We have 4 species that had their population sizes reduced, and 4 species that had their population size increased. And looking closely, we can see that the species that were disadvantaged by frequent fires actually had population reductions of up to 95%. And in fact, one of the species, the second one, Aristida jubata, that species was actually one of the 5 most important species to community abundance in 2015. And after fires, its population was reduced in over 95%, and it left the 5 most important species. In contrast, the benefited species more than tripled their abundances, with increases of over 200% in their abundance. And if you pay attention, there's a scale break here, because this second species, Axonops pressus, actually had an increase of 1,100% in its population after the 7 consecutive fires. In fact, this species was the one that became the 4th most important species to community abundance in the second sampling. And this increase made this species actually account for 8% of the total individuals in 2022. But now we want to know what makes the species benefited or disadvantaged by frequent fires. And for that, we looked into the species attributes to see if we could find some answers. And well, the first and most obvious thing would be the growth form, presence of rhizomes, if the species is annual or perennial. And actually, that's not something that is going to explain our groups, because all of our species, and in general, all of the Cerrado species, are perennial tussal grasses, which will form rhizomes. So these species are able to persist fires and all have the same traits. And then if you look at the physiological parameters, so the photosynthetic pathway, maybe we can find some answers. But actually no, because all our grasses are C4 species, and they also have the same photosynthetic type of C4 photosynthesis. So none of this actually explains why some species are benefited or disadvantaged. And then we looked into their ecology. So first we went into resprouting and bud protection. So that's an important step to look into, since bud protection allows some species to resist, some individuals to resist fire by protecting their structures that will allow resprouting. And higher bud protection, that would be tonic grasses, which are grasses which have their bud banks protected by leaf sheaths. These species would likely be better protected and have better survival and persistence chances than species with basal resprouting that have buds on the surface of the soil. But if we look at these traits in our species, we can see that there's not quite a pattern. So basal and tunic resprouting is widespread in all species, below ground, both on benefited and unaffected species. So this did not seem like something that would explain our results. And then, if you look at fire-stimulated flowering, which is a common response to grasses in the Cerrado after fire, we might see something. So increased fire-stimulated flowering could increase the chances of seedling recruitment after fire, as it increases the flowering and the availability of seeds in the post-fire environment. However, fire-stimulated flowering is also a widespread trait in savanna and cerrado grasses, both in benefited species, disadvantaged species, and unaffected species. None of these explains what are our results. And then we went, okay, let's look into species colonization ability. Let's look at how species can colonize and occupy space. And that's where we find some interesting answers to our question. So looking into the vegetative spread after fire, these are species that are able to colonize new gaps by rhizome fragmentation, clonal propagation, clonal reproduction, stolons, whatever. These are species that can vegetatively produce new individuals after fire. And we find a pattern that 3 out of 4 benefited species had this trace. These species are species that can, after fire, increase their population sizes vegetatively. So that's no other species, either disadvantaged or unaffected, had this possibility. And then, when you look at rudorality, which is a trait in which species are able to colonize disturbed gaps via seeds, so these ruderal species would be species with a higher investment in seed colonization and consequently a trade-off with survival. If you look into it, we find that the 3 out of the 4 disadvantaged species have the ability to colonize disturbed gaps and therefore invest more in seeds. Therefore, these 2 traits appear to be definitive for classifying the species and for predicting the species response to frequent fires in the Cerrado. So what's the take-home message? So just the concluding remarks. Well, the reintroduction of fire, even in the high 7 annual fire frequency, benefited the grass community. It doubled the abundance of individuals. It did not change richness, but it increased the total number of recorded species. And it increased community resilience by filtering the fire-sensitive species and increasing the populations of fire-adapt and fire-resistant species. The reintroduction of fire arises as an important management solution to fire-suppressed cerrados, and we see now that for these cerrados, it is a possibility to increase its resilience by applying prescribed fires. And we see that species with strong vegetative spread are the ones that are going to be benefited by the frequent fires, and the ones that are responsible for increasing community resilience and the abundance in the community. So that was what we find out. Thank you for your attention. I'll be very happy to answer your questions or catch up later.
Thank you, Hudson. We actually do have time for one question, if there's a question on the floor. Tony.
Thanks. Yeah, it would be really interesting to do something similar in South Africa without burning trials. But what I wanted to ask, that number 30 species, that's quite a high number for that number of samples, at least by South African standards. Do you think you could get more species over time? Like, how does 30 grass species compare to the number of species you get in the broader region?
Sorry, I couldn't quite hear you.
So I was just asking about the number of species. You got 30 species in total.
Yeah, we got 30 species in total. And
yeah, which is quite a high number, I think, for 120 quadrats. So I was just wondering, would you expect that to be even higher in pristine sites in your region?
Okay, so we have a recorded total 30 species within the 120 quadrats we sampled. Within each quadrat, we get a mean of 3 and a range of 1 to 7 to 8 species. But that's actually a common number in the Cerrado. I'm not really sure if you'd get a little higher, but we can get a little higher in the number of species. But it's really because the Cerrado is a high diversity, but we can get a lot of species within a few samplings. So we do get a really high number of species, and I think Bruna will maybe show that in the next talk.
Thanks, Hudson. Tony, I'm sure you can ponder on it a bit longer and then chat to him tonight. Thanks. So our next speaker is Bruna de Campos. We're still in the Brazilian highlands. So she's going to talk to us about the complex relationships in the Cerrado grasslands by pulling together the biomass, plant species richness, and the fire history.
So good afternoon. My name is Bruna Campos. I am a PhD student at State University of Campinas in Brazil. And today I'm going to show you some results of my PhD and talk about the relationships between biomass, plant species richness, and fire history. So understanding species richness has been a central quest for biologists since the times of Humboldt, Darwin, and Wallace. And understanding the distribution of diversity patterns has been one of the more study themes in this endeavor. And we have an extensive literature surrounding the characterization of these patterns and some theoretical explorations about the processes that underpin these patterns have been intensive and ongoing. So, as I said, there is a lot of literature surrounding these issues. And when we are looking to the relationships between species richness and biomass, we have several types of results. And some of them have been reported, like these review papers that show some positive, negative, humpback, and U-shaped relationships. But as we can notice, some of them didn't find any relationship. So apparently, this is a still controversial issue, although it is widely studied. So continuing my story, everybody today has talked about fire, and I will talk again that fire is a major biotic factor shaping grasslands and savannas. And in fact, if we look to the map, we can see that fire activity is higher in the tropics. So fire makes these relationships, biotic relationships, even more complex. So there is a growing body of literature studying fire effects on open ecosystems. And when we are looking just to the relationship between fire and above-ground biomass, we have some controversial results. And in this case, I just brought two examples. So in the panel in the left side, we can see that the total above-ground biomass is different between sites that were excluded from fire for different years, like when they are excluded for longer, they have more accumulated biomass. But on the other hand, some studies doesn't show any difference between leaf biomass as long time goes by without fire. Now looking to the relationship between fire and plant species richness, we also have some controversial results. So on your left side, again, we have some studies showing the difference that richness is higher in burned patches than unburned ones. But on the other hand, we have some studies showing, when comparing species richness per life form, and comparing between some fire treatments, like annual, biennial, or fire exclusion, they didn't find any significant differences. So looking all these results that I showed, we believe that there isn't just an outcome of these relationships, and that this is what motivated us to see what's going on in Cerrado grasslands. So I will answer these questions during this presentation. And the first one, if if the amount of accumulated above ground biomass influence plant species richness per square meter, if time since last fire influence accumulated above ground biomass, and if time since last fire influence plant species richness per square meter. So to do this, we sampled 15 Cerrado grasslands in 5 different states in Brazil. And you can see in the map, each one of these points is one of our sites. And here I show you some of the pictures of our sites. And it's important to say that all the sites have different fire history, and they have something in common. All of them is dominated by a herbaceous layer. To select the sites, we used the line interception method to select sites with a maximum of 20% of tree cover. And in each site, we arranged 3 parallel transects of 100 meters long with 50 meters distance from each other. And in each transect, we arranged 10 plots of 1 square meter to sample the plant community. So in the picture, you can see an example of our plot. And in each of the 30 plots, we recorded all the species inside of it to get the plant species richness. And in 5 plots, we clipped the above ground biomass to estimate the accumulated biomass per square meter. And this included standing leaf and dead biomass that was still attached to the vegetation. And finally, to get the time elapse since last fire, we analyzed Landsat imagery from 1985 until 2021. We looked for burn scars using false color composites. All right, as you can see, there is a lot of results that the people already had shown. And I decided to show you first what I was expecting of my results. So when we are looking to the results of accumulated above ground biomass and plant species richness, this is what we were expecting. Like, it's a decrease in species richness as you increase the above ground biomass, and I will explain you why. When we were in the field trips, we observed in some sites that the accumulated biomass sometimes can shade other sun-loving species, and we believe that this could lead to a decrease in species richness. And this above-ground biomass is usually by grasses that they form these very, very big tussocks. So this is what we found. We didn't find any relationship between species richness and above-ground biomass. And regarding our second question, if time since last fire influenced the accumulated above-ground biomass, we were expecting increasement of biomass as time goes by without fire. And we thought this mainly because there are a lot of studies showing that as time goes by without fire, the accumulated biomass increases mostly because the wood encroachment. But one more time, this was not our case. We didn't find any relationship between these 2 variables. But we also expected lower biomass quantities in sites that caught fire in the recent years in relation to sites that caught fire didn't caught fire for a longer period. But as you can see here, our 5 sites that showed the higher amounts of biomass are these ones that are with the circle, But if you can notice, right is in this dashed red line, the 2 of the sites with the higher biomass quantities just caught fire like in 1 year. The last fire is in 1 year. And this happens mostly because there are some studies showing that herbs and grasses, they are able to recover in 1 year or less after fire, and this happens because grasses can mobilize stored resources to resprout fast. And finally, our third question, if time since last fire influenced plant species richness per meter square. This is what we were expecting. So a decrease in species richness as long times go by without fire. And finally, and we were expecting this because fire eliminates biomass in litter, it relieves competition for light and space, and stimulates the resprouting of plants that are in the bud banks, and it can enhance seed production and germination because of the oscillation of temperature. And finally, we find a relationship, so you can see in the graph that species richness per square meter decrease as time goes by without fire. So to summarize my results, I made this figure. So we didn't find a relationship between biomass and richness. We also didn't find a relationship between fire and biomass, but we did find a relationship between fire and species richness. So the counterintuitive results bring new insights about Cerrado grasslands functioning and show that the relationships between biomass, species richness, and fire history are not as straightforward as previously thought. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Bruna. We do have time for at least 2 questions. The mic's on its way.
Thank you for a very interesting presentation. I'm wondering whether this, in the areas that hadn't burnt for a long time, whether the species were absent or whether they were just dormant, because we've been sampling in a grassland that had also not burned for many years, and we expected there to be very few species. And we sampled 24 1 square meter plots and found almost 100 species. So are you sure the species are absent in the areas where you haven't had a burn for a long time?
Actually, no, I'm not sure if the species were absent because we didn't do any analysis regarding this type of, we don't dig or anything, just we collected everything was above ground.
I have one other question. In the high altitude grasslands of South Africa, there have been some studies looking at the effect of burn frequency on diversity. And their conclusion was that it's actually, if you want to maximize diversity, you should have a variety of burn frequencies because you have different species compositions in different burn frequencies. So instead of always burning once a year, or you should have some areas where you burn once a year, other areas where you burn every 3 years. Did you have a look at differences in species composition between your sites?
I'm not sure if I understand your question now, but our sites have a different fire history, but we don't sample it in any of it like one more time. So I don't have this answer.
All right, thanks. I think we can maybe try and discuss that in detail a bit later. If you guys can maybe just try and meet up later this afternoon or just after the session. Thanks. All right, our next presenter, Isaac? Yeah. Our next presenter is Isaac Smith. He's going to try and unravel the role of scientists in balancing the media coverage of fires in our national parks. Thanks.
Thanks, Kathy, and thanks for the opportunity. So in 2020, the African Journal of Forage and Range Science sent out a question to solicit abstracts for a special issue. And the question they ask is, fire, friend or foe? And asking that type of question to this audience seemed like a silly question to Savanna ecologists. It's clear from all the presentations that we've just listened to. So my co-authors and I decided, let's maybe ask a more vocal and arguably a more influential group of people what they think are the answer to this question than Savanna ecologists. So we decided to ask the question to the media. The media influence how people think. It's a source of information for a lot of people. It influences their behavior, their perspectives, etc. So we thought we're going to ask the media, not through questionnaires or interviews, but we're going to see what they say and what they write about fire. So I thought when I was listening here to the talks prior to myself, I thought I should have rephrased my research question. My research question now is the response of media to fire. Okay, like we've looked at the response of birds, ants, termites yesterday, below ground biomass, etc., to fire. Let's see how the media responds to fire. And then as an additional driver, how does this change if you throw scientists into it? So our question is, what is the narrative that is propagated by the media about fires within and around national parks in South Africa? And does this narrative change when scientists are involved as well? So we asked Pair Africa, which is a media company that monitors all media that come out on sandparks, and they send us reports monthly so that we can see what people like and what they don't like, and to see what's brewing in the media. And you can see they look at various print and online sources, TV stations, radio stations, quite an extensive suite of media. And we asked them to subset that information for a 2-year period and send us all the stories that's got fire and fire management in the data, in the context of sandparks or some of our parks. So of course you had to clean the data because people also got fired and shots were fired, etc. But we cleaned the data and ended up with 390 media reports. And we then developed a code book, and the code book was to read through this, look through the TV clips, listen to the radio clips, and then classify to say whether certain things are absent or present. So were scientists absent or present? What type of photos or images did they use? What was the main themes? What was the sentiment expressed? We looked at intercoder reliability between those of us that did the coding, and then we extracted 2 metrics. The one metric is just how many times out of this 390 reports did you, for example, have a scientist involved, or did they show a fireman or fire lady? And then also we weighted that by reach. So a local newspaper, the Lowvelder or the George Herald, would have a reach of maybe a couple of thousand, but the SABC2 News would have a reach of 2 million. So the penetration to influence society differs between these different medias. So we could convert the number of stories into the reach. And that's what I'm going to reflect on today, is on the reach, not the number of stories, but the actual reach. So we identified 3 main biases in the way that the media report. So fire, friend or foe, the response of the media, foe. You can see that most of the sentiment, they only talked about the negative effects or the potential negative effects or the fact that the negative effects didn't happen. So it was very biased towards the negative effects of fire. So the sort of more nuanced perspective of fire as both a friend and a foe potentially didn't come out in the media. And you can see this is just from some of the fires in the garden route. This is the top paragraph that summarized the article, and you can see the type of words that's being used. Rage is out of control, wreaked havoc, fire ravage, destruction, rips through, scars, raging. So you can see it's quite emotive words and it's quite negative words. That's just to sort of illustrate the language that's also being used by the media when they reflect on fires. The second bias that we came across is that these fire ecology concepts that we talk about a lot here, and that's really very, very basic to the understanding of fire. If you understand these concepts, there's a lot of variation on it, as we've seen through this morning. But if you understand these concepts, you have at least some handle on understanding the world of fire out there. So the benefits of fire, fuel loads, fire regimes, fire weather. And we didn't look specifically for these words, but we looked for these concepts in the articles or in the media, in the radio interviews or TV clips. And you can see it was rarely there. So we feel that the media is not really empowering people by providing them just a couple of concepts that would help you to have a somewhat more rounded and mature understanding of fire. And I like to explain it using this graph, which is the typical thing that one will have at a conference like this. But this is where they ask Canadian people living at the urban wildland interface in an area that burns to talk about fire and how they see fire. And it was the community and it was the fire brigade and fire managers, etc. And you can see it affects a lot of things. There's a lot of moving parts when you start talking about fire. And it fell out into these 3 main domains: the risks associated with fire, the benefits of fire, and then the drivers of fire. If you then plot back onto this space of fire in a socio-ecological system, what the media reports on, you can see that it's really a very, very small window of the whole thing of fire in a socio-ecological system that are exposed. So it's all about the risks, and it's actually very few blocks. So the media doesn't necessarily enable people to have a more systemic understanding of fire. And then the third and final bias that we detected was that it was mostly reactive. The stories was about putting out fires, fire suppression, the proactive aspects of fire, the stuff that you should do before the fire or putting in management fires, etc., received very little attention, or the removal of alien trees or how that changed the fire regime. So to get back to the narrative that is prevailing based on this study, and this has been shown in other countries as well, is that really fire is bad and we need to put it out. And that's sort of the prevailing narrative. So I would argue that this has potential implications if we believe Morrison in his quote, that the media is influential. If this is the information that people hear all the time about fire, how do you think it feels for a manager to put in a management fire in an urban wildland park, for example, in the Garden Route National Park or Table Mountain National Park, or in Kruger next to communal areas? It might also lead to an over-reliance on fire suppression. That is the tool in the toolbox, rather than all the things about preempting fires or using fire as a tool. And this can then also be reflected in funding allocation. And then finally also, it creates fire-anxious communities instead of fire-resilient communities. So fire-resilient communities, as it's used in the literature, is communities that understand that fires are part of the landscape in which they live. They're not surprised that there is a fire, and they mitigate the risks associated with fire, and they potentially build in appropriate places and do appropriate fuel management, etc. And one can just see how fire-anxious communities would respond very differently from fire-resilient communities, also on social media. So that's the first part of the presentation. And then we actually looked at the stories that included scientists, okay, where the scientists were identified as scientists. And it was really interesting. About 9% of the stories, which I think is pretty high, actually had a scientist involved, but the reach of those stories were 2.3%. Okay, so scientists did join the narrative, but not in really big platforms and not in very charismatic ways. So maybe in much smaller niche magazines, for example. But leaving that as it is, the three circles there just show the differences when you have the media without the scientists and the media with the scientists. And in the red circle, you can see it actually jumps up to 95.5% of only negative sentiment, so fire as foe. When you include scientists, it's much more nuanced. It's fire as friend and foe, 64%. In the blue circle, you can see that proactive fire management, when scientists become involved, they've got very little to say about firefighting, but they've got quite a lot to say about proactive fire management and fuel management. And then fire ecology concepts in 80% of the stories where scientists were involved, those concepts were mentioned and it was part of the narrative. Without scientists, it hardly ever made it into the media. So this is the typical, or stories that you can typically see. I've shown you some of these earlier as well. Biggest disaster, it's about evacuation, etc. It's quite negatively framed. But there are stories in the media that's trying to bring science into the narrative, that's providing a bit more nuance, that's about learning. It's not just saying it's bad, it's saying, well, what can we learn from it? Because obviously fire is a foe as well. And we have multiple examples of that in South Africa. So I think one should also be careful to make out fire only as an ecological process that's got benefits. I think we in this audience should also sort of be cognizant of fire as a foe. And an interesting side note is one of our co-authors actually lost his house to a fire in the Garden Route, part of the study. So just as a final comment, once we've written this paper, you know that part in the end where you say recommendations? So the recommendation is that scientists should communicate about fire to the media. And then the paper was accepted and I'm like, oh, oops, now we probably have to communicate with the media. This is the recommendation that we made and we should possibly be engaging the media. So we wrote a story for the conversation. And I just checked last week before the conference, the paper, the scientific paper has been viewed just over 200 times. The story in the conversation has been read or viewed close to 3,000 times. It's been shared a couple of hundred times on Facebook. It's been tweeted. There were 2 radio interviews from that. I saw there was a feature in a popular magazine, on a timber magazine in the forestry. And I was actually at a fire symposium in the Southern Cape, and there was a editor of a popular magazine on fire and rescue in South Africa, and she referred to the article in the conversation. So that was just really sort of proof of the pudding that we need to also put our science stories into the broader discourse if we want to have traction. So, of course, you can't write a story before you've properly done the science, but I do think it's just sort of a recommendation that we translate our science also into the public domain. And just as a final reflection, well, I actually already said the first part of it, and I think socio-ecological topics in particular, as quite often quite uninformative and biased, because people have specific value systems, which is fine, but I do think it's important to just provide science in that domain as well. But there's also a cautionary note with that I've seen the media also sometimes use, or scientists use the science to actually push a specific viewpoint or a specific agenda, so selective use of science to make it seem robust and to make it seem like a scientific and a well-balanced and unbiased study. But there's also a risk that science can be used wrongly in the media. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Isak, for a very insightful talk. We do have time for one quick question. Carla?
I can hear.
Great. Do you have any idea what types of publications or articles tended to have a scientist, like consult a scientist before writing? So is it like long form versus huge, or like, did you get a feel for the difference in the different types of news covers that I
Carla, wait. They can't hear you on the stream if you...
Do I have to repeat for those people? Do you have any idea, what did I say? What's the difference between the types of articles that either do or don't consult a scientist? So are there like long form news articles that are more likely to capture nuance, but also to speak to scientists? Which leads me to my ultimate question is like, to what extent do scientists have a say in whether they are consulted? And what would you suggest to people to be consulted more often?
Yeah, thanks, Carla. So I think the news aspect of fire doesn't include scientists, and the news and the sensationalist part. So it's usually longer format things that include scientists. And we actually spoke as co-authors quite a lot in when do you have to engage, because right after something has burned down, I don't think it's time to put into the narrative that fires are beneficial. You know, that would seem insensitive and the timing would be wrong. I had a very positive experience with the conversation, because the conversation, you as the scientist write the story, they've got incredible editors that improve it and make it even more accessible, and it can be republished everywhere, and it's followed by a lot of media houses. It's like they call it a science amplifier or a media amplifier, so it can be republished everywhere, but you remain the author. And I think as scientists we're quite often quite hesitant to communicate with the media, because out of context or misquoted or things like that. I was quoted saying on the drought, for example, in Kruger, that Sandpark scientist Isak Smit mentioned that there were temperatures exceeding 27 degrees centigrade measured during the drought in Kruger National Park, which was actually 27 days above 40 degrees, you know, so I felt very stupid. So I think these type of places where you keep the narrative but you're helped by the media to put it out there is a useful way. And yeah.
Thanks, Isak. Thanks for re-summarizing your question, Carla. All right, our next presenter is Urs. He's going to be chatting to us about fighting wildfire with prescribed fires in the southern Great Plains of the USA.
Good afternoon, folks. Can you all hear me? I guess I'm on. Isak could not have set the stage better for my talk than he did. Fantastic. Thanks, Isak. I could talk at length about what he's covered, but I'd better stick to my script, otherwise my 15 minutes are going to fly away. What I will say, though, is I think the media is incentivized to create negative or sensational stories, and therefore the more scientific information about fire is often lost in the chaos and the enthusiasm, whatever else they're trying to promote. And I think really important is this differentiation between wildfire or escape fire and prescribed fire, which I actually don't particularly like the term prescribed fire. I prefer managed fire, but in the United States we do call it prescribed fire. So my talk today is going to focus on the use of prescribed fire to fight wildfire in the southern Great Plains. Folks who are on there are former students of mine, and Morgan Treadwell is our extension person who's been fantastic in this project that was funded by the Fire Science Program in the United States. So I'm going to just very quickly cover these items, and I'm not going to describe them here, but I want to talk about wildfire proliferation and what do we mean by wildfire, because I think we really need to be clear when we talk about wildfire what we're talking about. Then I'm going to talk about some of the regulatory factors influencing the use of prescribed fires, legal factors, regulatory fires, and then social fires. And then I'm going to wrap it up talking about prescribed burn associations as a facilitatory tool for implementing fire. So earlier in the conference, we heard that some folks focus on the problem, others focus on the solution. I'm going to try and do both, focus on the problem and then talk about a solution to the problem. So what is wildfire? Well, the important thing is when we talk about wildfire, we're always talking about something that's of value that is lost. So this definition here from UNEP, an unusual or extraordinary free-burning vegetation fire that negatively influences social, economic, and environmental values. So the same fire could burn in an area where there's no human infrastructure or where perhaps the resources aren't that valued, and it probably would be called a natural fire rather than a wildfire. Mostly wildfires are intense fires. And the reason why they've become intense, particularly in the United States, is because of fire suppression policy ever since the formation of the U.S. Forest Service. Gifford Pinchot, who was the first head of the U.S. Forest Service, got federal funding to support the agency because he said we need to protect these timber resources from burning up. So that's where it all started. And ever since then, the sort of Western mindset that fire is bad, Western when I'm talking about coming from Europe to the Americas, where fire previously had been very prolific or very common, that whole policy changed. As a result of that, we've had fuel load accumulations in the forests. We hear about these massive fires that we have now as a result of these accumulated and moribund forests, but we also have it in other areas, including Texas, where we have a lot of woody plant invasion, more in the form of shrubs, such as juniper and mesquite. So then the question is, despite knowing the increase of risk of wildfire, WUI, wildlife urban interface development patterns are increasing. So the question is why? Why would people go and build in hazard-prone areas? So this is a current PhD student of mine. He calls it the production of destruction, which I think is really clever. And he's looking particularly at the Bastrop fire in Texas. But we see this everywhere, that we build in areas that are hazard-prone, and then are surprised when the hazard hits us. All right, and so the WUI, what's happening is people are moving out into urban or into more rural areas, into areas where there are probably invaded rangelands, which have got woody plants, such as juniper, and they don't want to remove them because those junipers give them privacy, especially on smaller properties. And so we set ourselves up for the disaster. So why is this happening? Well, we want to be away from the main urban space, but also because developers are never held liable. They build and they shall be gone. And then afterwards, the owner is left holding the bag. And the developers are never sued over constructing in areas that were not designed safely. So here is just some loss information. The light blue bars show economic losses, and the dark blue bars show insurance coverages, or insurance payments. And you can see that from 2017 onwards, it's really jumped, except for 2019. Don't have the last 2 years of data yet. Really important on the bottom right-hand picture here. That's an area that was burnt out. So what's going to happen in the future with the redevelopment of this area? Do you think there'll be any changes? No. The homes are going to be built exactly where they were before, because if we look at the infrastructure, the roads, all the utilities, they're still in place. So things are going to be built back exactly the way they are. There's not going to be any change any change in the future development. Okay, so what I really want to focus on for the next few minutes here is these legal, regulatory, and social factors affecting the use of prescribed fire. And I developed this a few years ago when we just started this project. When we think about legal and regulatory factors, the two that I'm really interested in today, and I'm going to talk about, is district court judges who rule over escape fire cases. So we're interested in knowing what are their perceptions about prescribed fire and how might those be changed. County commissioners also have a real influence on determining regulatory frameworks and also judgments in the case of prescribed fire. Isak very nicely covered the media hype story, but also these regulatory and legal aspects place constraints on when landowners can burn. And these influence the social drivers. And the two that I want to really focus on most are the subjective norms. Subjective norms, for those of you not social scientists, are norms of behavior that we all adhere to living in a particular social context. And that may change from place to place. So in the case of prescribed fire, there are some areas where fire is considered to be a good thing, like Kansas, where people burn every single year, and there's a pro-fire policy there. But in other areas, such as Texas, which is where fire is considered to be problematic, there's a negative attitude towards fire. And then also skills and resources. Often landowners, in the state of Texas, 95% privately owned landowners often do not have those skills and resources in order to be comfortable in applying fire. So that's going to affect their decisions about the use of prescribed fire. I'm not going to talk about information input. Often we talk about we just got to give more information and everybody will make the right decisions. Right, yeah. Well, anyway, so what I'm going to focus on now is legal liability issues, and particularly with respect to district court judges, regulatory drivers, especially with respect to county commissioners, and then a couple of aspects on the social drivers, and particularly effective heuristics, which are mental models, the way that we make decisions in life using shortcuts based on prior experience or the influences that we had, and then some social norms. So really quickly, in the United States, we have 3 different types of legal statutes. We have strict liability, which only apply to Wisconsin and Michigan. So I'm not going to talk about those. I'm really more interested in simple negligence, which apply to most of the states that actually have statutes with respect to escape fire. In this instance, a burner must practice reasonable care in applying a burn in order not to be held liable for an escape fire. Of course, reasonable care is the kind of language that attorneys just love, because they can fight over it all day. And as a result of this, there's a lot of fear about applying a prescribed fire because of legal liability. And then gross negligence. And this doesn't mean to say that people are grossly negligent. It just simply means that if you follow certain codified practices, then if a fire escapes as a result of factors that are beyond your control, you are not held liable. And you can see particularly there in Florida and Georgia is where it started, and several other states have started adopting this. Importantly, a study we did showed that in areas with gross negligence there was more area burnt and there were more frequent prescribed fires used than in areas with simple negligence. So we did a survey of county court judges, district court judges, and wanted to really understand what they thought would happen if the law changed from simple negligence to gross negligence in Texas and Oklahoma. Both states have simple negligence. And you can see from that bar chart there that the blue bars are in all cases longer. That refers to simple negligence. All of those items on the y-axis there indicate particular criteria that they would consider being evidence of negligence. So under gross negligence, far fewer of them selected those particular significantly fewer selected those items as being evidence of negligence. So the point is that a change from simple to gross negligence statutes could lead to more favorable judgments for prescribed burn or prescribed burners in cases of escape fire damages. Importantly, though, judges had very little understanding of what prescribed fire was about. They had almost no knowledge, and very few of them ever handled a case. It's quite interesting. We had quite a low response rate. You might have noticed at the beginning only 20%. And one of the reasons they gave for not wanting to participate in the survey is they said they wouldn't want to be held to anything that they said in the case. They should rule over such a case in the future. And we told them it's completely confidential. We disassociate the responses from the respondent's name. Okay, then the other thing is burn bans, which are put in place by county commissioners who are elected officials when conditions are such that it's considered to be, a dangerous situation. The problem is, when burn bans are put in place, are exactly the kinds of conditions that we should be burning in order to be able to restore woody plant-infested rangelands where get hot, intense fires, which can literally flip a system with a single fire from an invaded woody system to an open grassland savanna system again. And I can talk about that later if we have time. So we also did a survey, and basically we asked the county commissioners what they thought or where they got information from. So they were much more familiar with prescribed fire, and most of them had dealt with burn bans because that was part of their job. Importantly, is they were quite objective in making those decisions in most cases, even though they were elected officials. So elected officials are subject to public opinion. And so if there's a negative opinion about fire among the public, then elected officials tend to respond in the same manner. But they did use high fire danger indices as a determinant. Importantly, though, they reached out most frequently to fire officials when they should implement a burn ban. And again, we've got to remember, fire officials, their job is to put out fires, it's not to start fires, although increasingly they're using fire to try and reduce some of the fire risk. Okay, then the last aspect here is the social drivers. So we conducted a series of interviews, 66 respondents from different agencies and entities, and asked them how they make decisions about prescribed fire. And most indicated that in this graph here, we can see that 47%, nearly half of them, indicated that they use heuristics. They don't do a clear analytical assessment of whether they should burn or not and what the pros and cons are. So if somebody has a negative attitude about fire, it's very likely they're not going to burn. It doesn't matter how much information you give them, they're not going to burn unless you get them engaged. So the findings suggest the need to reframe the prescribed fire communications to the public, rethink prescribed fire regulations, and reshape liability insurance for practitioners. Okay, the last item here, and I'm going to go through this really quickly because I'm going to run out of time. Importantly, what I want to point out here is that in trying to understand the social norms that are affecting prescribed fire, so attitude towards high-intensity fires there on the right-hand side, what we found is that subjective norms was highly correlated with that, and then so was risk-taking orientation, and then previous experience with high-intensity fire was also positively correlated, though not strongly. Indirectly, though, more experience led to a higher risk-taking perception with respect to prescribed fire because people didn't think it was so dangerous, which led to more positive subjective norms regarding prescribed fire. So the result of this work led to the conclusion that we need more targeted engagement strategies, not communication strategies, but engagement strategies to shift subjective norms about prescribed fire. And so what do we use? Well, these prescribed burn associations were initiated in 1997 in Texas, and I'll show you just now a map have proliferated right throughout the Great Plains. Their role was to improve knowledge and skills regarding the use of prescribed fire, to reduce liability by providing safe fire application training, and to reduce costs by having joint fire equipment and also getting members to join together when a prescribed fire is applied. Therefore, they've got all the labor that they need. They provide a mechanism for reducing liability, but importantly, they themselves, the prescribed burn associations, are liable under the law. And I could give an anecdotal, a story which I don't have time for, where a prescribed burn association was sued for an escape fire, and as a result of that, actually dropped its insurance coverage for its members because they were targeted, so it was a very perverse outcome. And also really important is that people who are members of prescribed burn associations have a much more positive attitude about prescribed fire, including extreme fire or severe fire, and then it increases trust and reciprocity among neighboring landowners, which is a really positive effect when you're trying to implement this kind of management practices. So we need more prescribed fire to reduce wildfire risks by reducing fuel loads. We need to try and get county commissioners to be more willing to either defer or give exceptions for burning during burn bans, if we want to use this as an effective management tool. We need to understand that many landowners are more emotive in their decision-making, as we all tend to be often, rather than analytical. And also, really importantly, that these prescribed burn associations have a really important role to play. That's the map in 2008 of the proliferation of prescribed fire associations, prescribed burning associations throughout the plains. So the take-home message, Butch Taylor very eloquently, he's an amazing gentleman, said the bottom line is if ranchers want to use prescribed fire on a routine basis, they will have to organize at the local level to enhance their clout within the local community. And that's happened with these prescribed burn associations. Legal liability standards for applying fire directly influences the amount of it that is burned, and therefore we should consider moving from simple negligence to gross negligence. But attorneys resist that because it undermines their business model, right? I don't mean to be cynical, but I'm afraid it is true. And then prescribed burn associations can help overcome legal, social, and financial obstacles inhibiting the landscape use of prescribed fire. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Urs. We are out of time, so there's no time for questions. So we are running into the second session for this afternoon. Thanks for so many of you still sticking around. So the next session will be more towards the interactive effects of fire and herbivory on vegetation. And to kick us off, Kevin Wilcox will talk about the combined effects of drought, fire, and herbivory on the Savanna plant communities.
Hey everyone, thanks so much for being here, and thanks to the organizers for setting up another great meeting. So I'm going to talk about two things in this talk. First, I'm going to talk about some analyses that we've been doing focusing on the legacy effects of the 2015 and 16 drought in Kruger on phenology and growing season length. And then I'm going to talk about a project that kind of came from some of these analyses and some of these thoughts associated with them about compound extremes and how the plant communities and how the savannas are going to respond to these compound extreme drivers. So I'd also like to acknowledge my collaborators here, Sally Kerner, Kim O'Keefe, Dave Thompson, Tertia Stridham. We're all in this together. So. All right, so many of you know here that there was a drought so extreme, it wasn't even extreme, it was exceptional. And so there's a map on the bottom right where the maroon areas in southern Africa show an exceptional drought that occurred a lot in a lot of southern Africa. And in Kruger National Park, it was some of the most intense droughts seen in a long time. Normally, the savanna looks like the background picture where you have a lot of forage for herbivores. This is a picture from 2016 in one of our experimental plots that we've been monitoring for a long time, showing that when this drought hit, most of the vegetation died, but even the vegetation that was able to hold on got hit by herbivores and was taken out. So it was just a barren landscape in there. And when you put this into the context of the long-term precip record, this is from Satara, the EBP region, it's the most extreme drought that we've seen, well, since we've been measuring rainfall. So we have been monitoring some plots in the Satara experimental burn plots since about 2004. And so we were able to kind of document what happened before, during, and after this drought. And so you can see here, this is Bothriacloa radicans, stinky grass, dominating a lot of this area. And this is a really important species to kind of structure the environment. After the drought, though, we did see complete resilience or the complete recovery of total plant growth. But the community dynamics were completely different. In certain areas, we found that an annual forb, Indigastrum parviflorum, took over these areas. And in other areas, more palatable grasses came in and dominated these systems. And so although plant growth bounced back completely within 1 year, the communities were completely different. And so that brought us to a question, like what other impacts do these community shifts have on the ecosystem function and the services they provide? And we were specifically thinking about the growing season and how that changed the phenology and the length of the growing season. So there's two questions I'm going to talk about here. One, what are the legacy effects of that drought on growing season length? And specifically, we're focusing on the greenness and the plants in the region. So as we predict that the more severe the drought, the shorter the growing season. And then two, if there are changes in growing season, what's driving that change? Is it that green up is happening later in the season, like we might expect if the plant community shifts to more drought-conservative plants that are slower growing? Or is there a quicker brown down? Is there an earlier end to the season because you have annual species coming in that grow, set seed, and brown down early? So to get at this question, we used NDVI data, which is from MODIS. And this is a metric of greenness from space. And yeah, we got it for the entire park at 500 meters by 500 meters resolution from 2011 to 2022. So let's just take a trip through here. This is the NDVI, and you can see these spikes going through years. That corresponds with the growing season. And then you'll see as we kind of get to the 2016 area, there is no spike. Things just are brown all the way through, and then we recover. We come back to having growing seasons again, which is great. But these 3 years right after the drought, 2017, 18, and 19, they're quite a bit shorter, and so we decided to look at these a little bit more in depth. So we use a program called TimeSat, to pull 4 parameters about the phenology within each of those pixels. So we looked at the beginning of growing season, the end of the growing season, the distance between those, which is the growing season length, and then, primary production, put that in quotes, because although a lot of people use this as a measure of primary productivity, it's actually integrative biomass, because it doesn't, if grazers or if herbivores come and eat this area, right, it doesn't account for that. So just keep that in mind as we're kind of going through these results. All right, so to tackle the first question, we have to quantify across the park what is the drought severity. And the way we did this is we looked at that ANPP, or that integrative biomass, in each pixel in the park, and then we compared it to that same pixel's ANPP during the drought, right? And that gives us kind of a reduction in biomass. And this shows us what we've observed during the drought, right? The southern regions of the park had a more extreme drought. The northern regions had a less extreme drought. So that gives us kind of a gradient, actually, of drought severity that we can then look at how the change in the growing season goes along with that drought severity. And so this shows every single pixel in the park. This is a 2D histogram because there's a lot of data in there. You can kind of use the lighter portions as almost like a trend line. And the x-axis, or the y-axis here is pretty wide. But what you can see, if you look at the more extreme drought areas, it's about a 40 to 50 day shorter growing season in those extreme areas in 2017. In 2017 was actually, it was not a dry year. So we don't think it's the rainfall patterns happening. And this happened in 2018 and 2019 as well. And this has major implications for wildlife as well as other ecosystem services. All right, for the second question, this could be due to a couple different things, right? We could have, there's 2 things. It's not rocket science. You can have later green up, or you can have earlier brown down, right? So we tested which of these 2 were more important in driving this. So the way we did this, these are, again, 2D histograms, where we just looked at the change in the day of green up, right? Anything to the right here means a later green up. To the left is a earlier green up. And then we linked that with the change in growing season length. All right, we did the same thing with the change in brown down. Right? It's just mathematical. These add up to the change in growing season. They have to. But what we see here is when we put them in a partial regression, we see that they both matter in dictating the change in growing season length, but more of the variance is explained by an earlier brown down, which suggests that in those years, we basically have the vegetation is browning down earlier in the season. All right, so that first section, just to kind of wrap it up, the first thing we learned from this is that there were 3 years of decreased growing season length, right? That's that legacy effect of the drought. And 2, both earlier brown down and delayed green up contributed to this shortening of the growing season, but earlier brown down was more important. And so, these legacy effects are real. One limitation with it, well, there's a few limitations with this, right? We can't really associate what are the drivers of this change in growing season, right? We could have herbivores going across the landscape and hitting areas more intensely, right, after the drought. Or we could have differential fire regimes occurring as well. And this really started us thinking that we need to understand these drivers and how they all interact with each other to understand what we're going to look at in the future with savannas. And the other thing I just wanted to remember, this is an ongoing project. We are extremely interested in what effect this had on herbivores and herbivore movement, health, and things like that. So if you have those data and you're interested in collaborating, let us know. Okay, so this kind of jumps into a new project that we just started this year, thinking about these compound extremes and how the combination of extreme drought, extreme grazing, which often comes with extreme drought, and extreme fire alter plant communities and the ecosystem functioning. So this is a project that my collaborators, Sally Kerner and Kim O'Keefe, who are here in this room, we are leading this effort. And we're also working closely with Dave Thompson from SAON and Tertia, of course, from Sam Parks. And so what we're doing right now, we have people in the field, I think currently, collecting a whole bunch of data to describe the plant communities and the individual plants in some plots that next year and the year after, we're going to implement extreme drought. We're going to simulate extreme grazing, where we come through and we remove biomass from multiple time points throughout the season, and extreme fire, where we simulate really, really hot, intense fires, right? And these are some pictures of some, these things are happening right now in the world. You have the extreme drought in Kruger on the left. Here's a picture from Kenya, where a lot of these lands are getting hammered by herbivores because they're in a multi-year drought. And there's a picture of a firestorm in Australia from 2019. Right? So these are things that we need to start thinking about. And see, these are just kind of fun pictures. So this is in January. We took out a whole bunch of people, and we had 4 Lycors running at the same time. Kim O'Keefe is our physiologist. And they took like 150 ACI curves, which is astounding for anybody who doesn't do ecophys. And we started getting some really great data. Up on the top right are these ACI curves where you see photosynthesis as it varies with CO2 concentration. And you see our 3 species that we focused on there are Bothriocloa radicans, Eragrostis superba, Panicum coloratum. They're very, very different, right? And so we can start to use this information as well as their traits and information about how they grow and their morphology to start making predictions about how these plants are going to do in the future. And we're tracking these same individuals throughout the entirety of the experiment and looking at recovery afterwards. All right, and so our grand plan here is to take all this empirical data and incorporate into process-based ecosystem models to be able to make predictions about the future. And I'll just say that whenever I work with forest process-based modelers, which is primarily the field, they always tell me we can't do grasslands. And the reason is because they think grasses are little trees. Every time I talk to them, they say, what's the DBH of a grass, right? We need to scale it up to the canopy. And so I humor them, and we went out and measured some DBHs, but we're actually kind of changing the way these models work. We're thinking about basal diameter, canopy diameter and trying to quantify these dynamics in a more realistic way for grassland-dominated or grass-dominated systems. And the reason we're doing this is we can then incorporate this into a model that allows for competition for light and nutrients and water in a realistic way, and then we can make predictions into the future about, if we have more frequent drought combined with fire, combined with extreme grazing, what are the savannas going to look like? And we're recruiting. So we're looking for postdocs and graduate students, specifically from South Africa, to work with our team to go through this project. And we've got 5 years to go, so we're excited about it. So come find any of us. We're nice, and chat with us. All right, lots of people to thank, including our funders, and so many people have helped us with these data and these ideas. And thanks for you.
Thank you, Kevin. Thank you very much. It's very insightful. We're going to move straight on. Our next presenter is Gareth Hampson, who's going to chat to us about fire and grazing as drivers of grass traits, their diversity, and community composition.
Hi, is this on? Yeah. Cool. All set. Right, hello everyone. Today I'm going to be talking to you about grass traits, grass trait syndromes, and how they sort of link to fire and grazing and to environmental gradients. Again, the work and the sort of ideas represent the efforts of many people, some of them listed below, but it's been a broad group of collaborators. It's been a lot of fun. So when we're thinking about grasses or grasses in particular, but also how plants relate to fire and herbivory, it's been very useful for us to think about this sort of process in 3 stages. So what happens sort of before a consumption event, what happens during a consumption event, and what happens after. And those things, I think what you find is that different suites of traits kick in at these different stages and shape sort of plant life histories. And so we published sort of a framework trying to understand plant life histories in relation to fire and herbivory a couple of years back. And this is sort of basically a sort of flow diagram. You start at the top and think about, for example, if in this before phase, there are attributes of plants that make them either palatable or flammable, and this will determine the likelihood of them getting eaten or burnt. So if a plant is toxic, for example, it's highly unpalatable, it can probably avoid that consumption event altogether. Other things are highly palatable or flammable, might actually have positive feedbacks and attract the consumer, but most things will sort of sit in between somewhere and will just get consumed. Okay. So then you move into this phase of like during the consumption event. Within that phase, I think there's a group of plants that will specialize in so really trying to manage which tissues or how much material is lost during that consumption event. So a nice example perhaps with the trees, say in a savanna tree, you might try and protect your stem above the ground, so this is in a sapling with really thick bark, and then resprout epicomically, so that could be like nice fire resistance. Or another strategy might be just to have underground reserves, and then you sort of you get top killed, and your game is to resprout afterwards and regrow. Okay, so sort of this sort of pathway, just to introduce some of the terminology, give you a sense of some of the things we've been thinking about. Another aspect of this is to just think about what makes plants palatable versus flammable. We tend to think of this along 3 axes. The first is sort of plant, the chemistry aspect, that quality. Things like the carbon to nitrogen ratio. Herbivores are trying to get nitrogen out of the environment. Fire is more interested in carbon, so they do separate on this axis a bit. Animals want moisture. Fire wants drier fuel. Animals want micronutrients. The next axis would be the quantity. And both consumers want maximum quantity, but there's a bit of a trade-off, so that's why this GNU is a bit lower. So as those plants get bigger, the structural support means more carbon and the quality goes down. Another aspect then, also linked to quantity, is how that material is arranged in space. So if you're thinking about grasses, if you've got sort of fairly sparse, then that allows good aeration, airflow through the fuel load. That oxygen helps that fire burn hot and carry on spreading. Whereas the animal, with its restricted mouth size, it wants as much food per mouthful. Okay. So higher bulk density, so how that material is arranged in space matters. Okay, so these are sort of things, that's sort of the platform for the data that I'm now going to show you. I did a whole bunch of fieldwork in Zambia and South Africa, also in Madagascar, but I don't have the isotope or the nutrient data for Madagascar yet, so I won't talk about it. But just to say that, I'm going to call these areas, 5 areas that I worked in. They span a rainfall gradient. This is Madikwe, the driest, at about just under 500 mils rainfall per year. In each of these areas, I sampled 3 to 7 sites, and I always made sure that there was a heavily grazed site and a frequently burned site. The local managers informed on this. Then within those sites, I got species composition and a whole bunch of traits. I'll mention the traits as I need them through the talk. So just to show, worked at Satara, Telperion on the Highveld, then Pollen Farm, southwest Kruger, so you're up to 900 mils rainfall, and then up at Kitwe in Zambia. Would have been more sites, but COVID got in the way, unfortunately. Right, so what I'd like to do now then is with these grasses is to try and organize them into trait syndromes, to try and understand their life histories. So to do that, I used hierarchical clustering on principal components, and as the name suggests, you select which traits you want to analyze and use for clustering, for grouping. Run a PCA on those, and the clustering is done on those principal components. The traits that I chose were specifically selected to represent that sort of flammability, palatability aspect of plants. So for quality, I used leaf nitrogen. Quantity, I used leaf table height, which is sort of the height to the main leaf biomass, not the full plant height, not to the top of the culm. Bulk density. And then I added a 4th trait because I want to get a sense of the plasticity of plants, and because I think that really plays into grass life history. So it's a slightly different one just to add in there. Did the clustering, pulled out 4 groups. I would love to switch some of these species around, but just go with it as it is. And so the analysis recommended 4 groups. And then what I've done is to then plot those back into that palatability, sort of flammability space. So these then are the four groups. We've got lawn species, maybe not the best name, but let's just go with it for convenience. High leaf nitrogen, very short and high bulk density. So these are highly palatable plants, probably low flammability. Then the next group would be these tall fire grasses, I'm going to call them. They've got high leaf table heights, and they're quite sparse architecture, so nicely aerated, so good airflow. They should burn hot. Fire should spread well through them. Next group would be these short fire grasses. Might not be clear why I call them fire grasses now, but it should come through in subsequent slides. It's sort of in between in a lot of regards. Like moderate bulk density. They're not that tall. Their leaf nitrogen is pretty low, so they're not that palatable. And then, also not very variable in terms of their heights and the range of heights that I saw. So sort of medium, low. And then the last group was these switches. So the only trait that pulled them out was this variability in leaf table height. Okay. Just to sort of try and paint a little bit of a picture of how the palatability and flammability of these groups might vary. This is just a relative index, very crude, using the ranking of species by their traits. So I just took the leaf N, what was the rank there, it's down-weighted the quantity aspects a little bit. So it's just using the ranks and flammability. I switched out to use leaf C to N, and then, penalizing bulk density a bit. It just sort of paints this broad picture that makes sense from the previous diagram, that these lawn species tend to be the most palatable and the least flammable. The most flammable are the tall fire grasses. And then, what the least palatable look like these short fire grasses, and so the switch is not doing too badly on either axis. Okay, a little bit of a caricature, just to give some more of a feel for these groups. Okay, so now these are traits that were not involved in the clustering. So now I want to have a look at we'd expect flammable plants to get burnt. So we'd expect there to be some sort of fire resistance traits that they display. So we had a look at some of these fire resistance traits. I've got 3 here, and they're all geared towards insulating the base of the plant from the heat of fire. The first one is the biomass ratio, shown over here. And we take the ratio of the biomass above 10 centimeters to below 10 centimeters. And the idea is that by carrying the flame zone higher above the ground, you can keep it cooler at the soil surface, and protecting those basal buds, which is the critical thing. And we see that the tall fire grasses have these higher biomass ratios and probably insulating themselves quite well using that sort of trait, I guess. The short fire grass is not apparent at all in them, similar to the lawn species, and then the switch is fairly high. Another way of insulating your basal buds from the heat of fire is to actually sink them below ground. So measure the crown depth. So that's what I'm trying to show there. Interesting here, the short fire grasses seem to have pretty deep crowns. So they're not really relying on the biomass ratio. They sink them down. But also quite a wide range of crown depths in the tall fire grasses, and the lawns mostly on the surface. And then the last trait was, I think, I'd like to chat about the tunic grasses a bit more, but this sort of idea of keeping your leaf sheaths at the bottom is kind of like an analogy for a bark thickness in grasses, like retaining your leaf sheaths to act as an insulatory layer against the heat of fire. And it comes out that the short fire grasses tend to do more of this. They tend to retain more leaf sheaths at the base. Okay. So I mean, in the flammable groups, we're seeing a little bit of variation in how they resist fire, and then the grazing grasses, I'm not seeing that. I'll go through this quickly. The grazing resistance, it's not my favorite traits, and I think we need to work on them, think about them. This basically tells you how much material is lost when you pull out a culm. And so in some senses, for the lawn grasses, we see less material lost. It's not an ideal measure because we need to think about culm diameter more, and we'll do that. Similar stemminess can, this is how many stems per unit basal area. Stems can get in the way of a grazer, and so it might help protect leaf material. We see slightly higher values in the lawn species. This talks about stolons, rooting at the nodes. We're seeing it across all groups, and by moving along the ground, you can keep stems and buds below grazing depth. It's slightly higher than expected in the lawn group there, but so nothing hugely compelling there, but just to show you for balance in the presentation. So how are these traits and these trait syndromes distributed across environmental gradients? So I've arranged the sites by rainfall, and then I put high fire sites at the top, the high grazing sites at the bottom. We see at these drier sites, the lawn species tend to dominate, and as you shift up the rainfall gradients, I'd like to suggest they replaced by switches there, but you're also seeing these tall fire grasses coming in. At the high fire sites, in the wet areas, dominated by tall fire grasses, some short fire grasses. As you move back down, those tall fire grasses tend to drift out. And then when you get down into these drier areas, there's quite a mix of functional groups or trait syndromes in these communities. Another way of looking at how these trait syndromes relate to environmental gradients is so this is about 92 species that I'm working on, and I just pulled the GBIF data for them and then created distribution ranges. And then across those distribution ranges, extracted the WorldClim rainfall and temperature data. And so we see these lawn species tending to occur in the drier areas, the tall fire grasses, sort of in these wetter areas, also in the hotter areas. Switches cover quite a broad range of rainfall conditions. And then I thought this is quite interesting, the short fire grasses are sitting in sort of cooler regions. I'd like to say these are emerging analyses, and it's what's cool to me is how it's sort of starting to just tick off some of the ideas that we've had. So just like hints of, but they do need refinement. Just as something else to show you, this is now only crown depth and biomass ratio. So I've taken 2 fire resistance traits and then looked at the turnover, the beta diversity across sites. So I've arranged sites. These are the high grazing sites with rainfall, high fire sites with rainfall. And the simple point that I want to make here is that this is within the same area. These sites are both in Madikwe Game Reserve. But, I mean, you've got a 0.86 turnover from the fire to the grazing site, and you move hundreds of kilometers to Satara, and you get very little turnover. And the idea is simply that within a landscape, consumers can, with feedbacks, can have a really strong effect in modifying the communities that you see there. Yeah. Okay, so just to try and sort of summarize things. It's sort of starting to make sense in my mind, early days. The lawn species, okay, here we've got, sorry, let me show you this first. This is a grazer biomass with rainfall. This is a fire, percentage burned with rainfall. So it makes sense. You tend to see grazer biomass peak at lower rainfalls. This is where we're tending to see those lawn species. They're less competitive for light, because they don't have these tall grass growth forms. And so in a way, it makes sense that as it gets wetter, that these switcher species would start to replace them. So any lapse of grazing, they're able to actually stand up and compete for light. I think another thing to think about is these tall fire species. I think they're really characteristic of these hot, wet environments. So I think really productive environments. I think that kind of growth form, it's very easy to generate that high biomass, that biomass ratio trait. So I think it's just sort of a natural consequence of being tall. But it's interesting that you don't really, that the crown depths and the leaf sheath packing may be less pronounced in those groups, but more unpacking to do. These short fire species, I think they're sitting probably in those sort of cooler, sort of high felt areas. And because they're not as productive, they're not able to build up that biomass ratio as easily. And I think, so there, it's interesting to me that you start seeing, in place of that, seeing higher crown depths and more use of leaf sheath packing. All right, I'll leave it there. Thanks, folks.
Thank you, Gareth. We are out of time. So we'll need to move straight on to our next presenter, Shashank Ongali, who's going to be talking about the tree, how it overwhelms fire intensity and elephant damage as a determinant of large tree top kill.
I think I jumped the gun on that title a little bit. Hi, my name is Shashank. I'm a PhD student at the University of Bayreuth in Germany. And what we're actually asking is, do fire intensity and elephant damage explain large tree top kill in African savannas? So fire and elephant herbivory are dominant forms of disturbances that affect woody plants in African savannas. Often this results in the complete loss of biomass above ground without whole plant mortality, and this is called top kill. Smaller trees like this face almost complete top kill, regardless of whether it's fire or elephant herbivory. But large trees, on the other hand, have a little bit of a complicated story. So fires are predicted to have almost no effect on large trees in general. That's what's widely believed. Elephants, on the other hand, produce they have a lot of negative effect on trees because they can even topple large trees. And it's widely believed that a combination of frequent fire and elephant herbivory can have a stronger negative effect on large trees than either driver alone. However, studies using individual tree data monitored over a long period of time, right here in Kruger, in the elephant impact transects, they have found that fire frequency actually doesn't explain large tree top kill. So they suggest that perhaps fire intensity and its variation in the landscape has a role to play. Climate conditions conducive to intense fires are expected to become more common in the future, and particularly also globally and also in African savannas. So high-intensity fires can cause large tree top kill through cambium necrosis because of high temperatures, leaf necrosis because of high flame height, and of course, hydraulic damage. Elephants indirectly affect large tree top kill because they expose stems through debarking or consumption, and that can make these trees further vulnerable to high-intensity fires. Efforts to better understand large tree top kill have a few problems. One of them is the scarcity of fire data. When you estimate fire intensities, in general, you have to measure the rate of fire spread. Typically, in typical savanna fires, how it's measured is you time the movement of the fire front from point A to point B. And in the high-intensity fires like this, it can be a bit challenging. So we address this by using an empirical model of fire intensity, which was proposed first by Higgins et al. 2008. So this model actually considers potential nonlinear effects of fuel load on spread rates, and it accounts for the fact that fire will spread more slowly for moister fuels, and fire will spread faster in windier conditions. And we expect that this model is applicable to a broader range of fire intensities than the Byram's equation that's been often used. So another problem, of course, is the scarcity of large tree data, especially ones that come together with the associated elephant damage and fuel load around the large tree. For this, we address this in two ways. One, we use smaller trees, responses of smaller trees to fires, and we extrapolate to larger trees. And another way is to try and put together available large tree data sets from different time periods. So the questions we're asking is, how does fire intensity estimated using the empirical model compare to field measurements? And then using top kill models fit to small trees, what is the probability of top kill for larger trees? And top kill models are essentially models which include plant characteristics like height and also fire intensities to estimate the probability of top kill. And the third question we ask is, of course, what is when we switch to large trees alone, we can ask, what is the effect of fire intensity, tree height, and elephant damage on the probability of top kill of large trees? And when we use this large tree data set alone, what is the range of the probability that we predict? So let me describe the model a little bit. So we don't have estimates of fire intensity, so we need the data to do that for us, to estimate that for us. So because we do that, we use a Bayesian framework where our response variable is top kill, which is a binary variable, 0, 1, which is influenced by stem height or tree height, fire intensity, and elephant damage. Depends on whether this information is available. But as you can see, fire intensity is an unobserved quantity. This is further influenced by using this empirical model by heat yield, rate of fire spread, and fuel load. Again, rate of fire spread, as I said earlier, it's difficult to measure in the field for especially high-intensity fires. This is estimated using fuel moisture, wind speed, and fuel load again. So fuel moisture information is also not usually available, so we try and assume a relationship between the volumetric soil water content and fuel moisture, and we parameterize that by using about 1,300 fires from the experimental burn plots in Kruger. So the result of this model is that when we fit this model to data, it'll provide us posterior distributions of the probability of top kill for each individual tree, the fire intensity that is associated with that tree, and of course, the parameter estimates. Now I'll just move on to the results. The data, of course. This model is fit to two different kinds of data sets. One is the small tree data set, from which we extrapolate, as I mentioned before. So we used a small tree data set from 1986, 87, and then 2002, 0, and 2003 from the experimental burn plots. And we have about 7,300 trees, 94% of which were smaller than 5 meters. This data set was used in Higgins et al. 2012. It was collected by Winston Trollope and subsequently by 2002 by Steve. And we have no elephant damage information here. Then we also fit the model later to this large tree data set, which is again from 1986-87, where we just use the individual trees which are taller than 5 meters. And we also use large tree data from the 2010 high-intensity fire in Afzal. So here we have a data set of about 530 individuals, and all of them are taller than 5 meters. And here we have elephant damage information, at least for the high-intensity fire experiment. But for the large trees here in 1986-87, we assume that the elephant damage is negligible because the elephant densities were quite low at that time relative to 2010. Firstly, we fit the model to the small tree data set. And as you can see here, the model predicts fire intensities of all the experimental burn plots as well as the top kill observations fairly well, especially at the lower intensities. You can see that at higher intensities, the model actually underpredicts the fire intensity. But in general, this is not a problem because fires exceeding 5,000 kilowatt per meter intensity are quite rare, even in the experimental burn plots and, of course, in general. The model does well for both dry and wet season. Then we fit the model and try and predict the probability of top kill. Here on the x-axis, we have the height of the tree. And these ticks on the x-axis just show that most of the trees are in this height range, and we have very few trees in the taller height ranges. And on the y-axis, we have the top kill probability. And this is posterior mean from the model plus 90% credible interval estimates. So if we, as an example, I took a 10-meter tall tree, and in a typical savanna fire of about 2,000 kilowatt per meter, we estimate a mean probability of top kill of 0.09. And as we increase the fire intensity to about 6,000 kilowatt per meter, you can see that probability of top kill for large trees is also going up. The mean goes up to about 0.2. Now, we fit the model to the large tree data set, and here this shows the posterior mean of the effects at the parameter, and the 90% credible intervals and the 95% credible intervals. Here we can see that fire intensity has no effect or significant influence on the probability of top kill of large trees. This is, mind you, using only the large tree data set of 530 individuals across a range of fire intensities. Further, there is actually no effect of elephant damage and also the effect of wound burnt. This is kind of the interactive effect of fire and elephant damage. It's the extent of the wound that the tree has suffered because of elephant damage that's been burnt. So we see again that there's no evidence of elephant damage and interactions between elephant damage and fire. So then, regardless of no significant effects, the model itself actually produces predictions because of all the variables combined together, and also because there are some effect sizes here. Here, as you can see, again, on the x-axis, we have fire intensity. And on the y-axis, we have top kill probability, mean, and 90% credible interval. So assuming, as an example, a tree of 10 meter, again, with an elephant damage of 10%, we see that the probability of top kill actually increases, but not quite that much. And you can see that it's quite uncertain. This has, of course, to do with the number of data points that we have and the way we estimate fire intensity itself. But going back, I wanted to focus on this 2,000 kilowatt per meter fire and the 6,000 kilowatt per meter fire. So if we recall, the model fit to small trees predicted a mean probability of 0.09 and 0.19. And the model fit to large trees, it actually predicts a lower top kill probability. So we need to make sure that we actually use large tree data sets and not extrapolate for large trees from small tree data. So because our model also predicts fire intensity, we've actually been able to estimate, get a new estimate for the fire intensity of the Afzal experiment, the high-intensity experiment. So in a paper published by Isaac and colleagues in 2016, they estimated the intensity of the high-intensity fire to be about 4,300 kilowatt per meter. We get a new estimate of about 5,500 to 5,700 kilowatt per meter. As I mentioned earlier, our model actually underpredicts the intensity for high-intensity fires. So again, this is also an underestimate, and the fire was probably a lot more intense. So to conclude, we can estimate fire intensity reliably using fire weather variables, that is, wind speed and volumetric soil water content, especially at low to moderate intensities. Small tree datasets are, of course, useful for predictions, but we need to be cautious that they actually overestimate the top kill of large trees. And fire intensity and elephant damage do not significantly influence the probability in this data set at least. And the data that we have currently do not support that burning of debarked area on large trees actually increases the probability of top kill. And this is not to, of course, undercut the importance of elephants actually toppling the trees and bringing those trees down into the fire trap. That's not what I'm talking about. It's just the burning of the debarked area on the large trees. And of course, we have an estimate for the probability of top kill of large trees of 0.3 to, it's not what, no, 0.03 to 0.05 across a range of fire intensities. Now, to summarize, large trees are actually not really fireproof, as we've seen. I mean, there is a finite probability of top kill. But we need to think about these probabilities in the context of the larger context of what is happening to large trees in the system. In a recent paper published just last week by Tertia and colleagues, last month, by Tertia and colleagues, they actually find that large trees are dying at an annual rate of about 6.4%. Regardless of the fire treatment. So there's clearly something else happening that is causing the mortality of large trees. So pinning the blame on fire alone is not going to get us much. So we need to actually prepare data sets that combine fire intensities, fire frequency, climate, and elephants together. And such data sets are actually very rare for large trees alone. Having said that, we still are able to estimate the probability, even though it's highly uncertain. We propose that the uncertainty can actually be reduced. One of the things that can be easily implemented, at least in the park, is to get measurements of fuel load and moisture in the, sorry about the ticks here, but fuel load and moisture measurements in the tree neighborhood. If you look at this picture, for example, imagine a large tree if a large tree existed in this area, the larger the landscape fire, burn, or whatever wouldn't have mattered for that tree because the immediate area surrounding that tree didn't actually burn. So you need better measurements of fuel load and moisture in tree neighborhood to better estimate the experienced fire intensity for that tree. Now, our method enables us to estimate the fire intensity without actually being in the field and using a stopwatch to do the rate of spread measurements. So if a ranger, for example, knew when he or she was going to burn an area, we can target specific large trees and measure these quantities around it, and then we'll be able to estimate fire intensity and get better estimates of the probability of top kill. Thanks to DAD for funding my PhD and to Sandparks for support, and all these people and members of the plant ecology at University of Bayreuth, two of whom are here, Amy and Edward. Go check out their talks tomorrow and day after. Thanks.
Thank you, Shashak. You have used up all your time, so unfortunately no time for questions. I just want to check if Marino is around. Okay, yes, definitely a no-show. There you go. Next pointer, back and forward. Okay. All right, so Tumbe is our very last speaker for the day, and he's going to chat to us about the effects of fire and herbivory on below-ground herbaceous regeneration. Thanks, Tumbe.
Okay, thanks. My name is Tumbe, and then I'll just give you a speed talk on a part of my PhD program, which is still ongoing. Majority of research that is looking on the effect of disturbance on a herbaceous layer in the open ecosystem, they mainly focus on the above ground part, with research on the below ground part recently gaining momentum. So I will speak on the effect of disturbance, looking more at below ground bud banks. Okay, just a brief intro. introduction. Below-ground bud banks is basically the population of meristems, both auxiliary and adventitious, that can form or produce on any below-ground organ and which can be used for vegetative regeneration. So we might be asking, what is the ecological significance of these below-ground bud banks? So the below-ground bud banks are very crucial in rapid regeneration post-disturbance, and they also enable majority of seasonal renewal in many plant communities, and they also influence plant population dynamics and eventually ecosystem functioning. So the objective of this talk, or part of it, will be to assess the response of bud-bearing organ and below-ground bud bank density of forb and grass communities. But for this talk, I'll mainly focus on the bud bank density and not much on the bud-bearing organs diversity. So to do this, or where and how did we look at this response of bud-bearing organs and the density of the bud bank? So the study was conducted at the Satara experimental band plot, and then was replicated at the Ngwanetsi EPBs. So the details of the study area was given by my colleague Venad earlier on. So to assess this bud bank density, what we did, we established a one-by-one plot where we checked the species composition, and then after that, we established a 0 by 5 to look at the bud bank community. And to do that, we had to dig up to 10 centimeter. The depth was up to 10 centimeter. And then we collected all the samples and transport everything to the lab where I did this. It was quite nice. So, and then, so just quickly, what we found was that below-ground bud bank density varies between fire treatments, site, herbivore treatments, and also between the two growth forms, which is forbs and grasses. But then if you look at the two sites, if you look at the two sites, the bud bank density in Satara does not vary significantly across the treatments, while in Ngwanetsi, it was lowest in the annual and highest in the triennial. And then when we look at the two growth forms, which is forbs and grasses, we can see that grasses accounted for more bud bank density, while forbs accounted obviously for less. And then the exclusion of herbivory, or the response of forbs and grasses to the exclusion of herbivory also varied between the two life forms. And then what we also found was that mainly 4 categories of bud-bearing organs were observed throughout the treatments, which are non-woody, rhizome, stolon, root crown, and bulb. Okay, so in conclusion, it appears that below-ground bud bank density as a measure of potential regeneration varies between fire treatments, which was shown by the 2 results from the Satara and Ngwanetsi, and also between, or like when we exclude herbivory, which was shown by how the 2 growth forms responded to herbivory exclusion. And then the suppression or exclusion of disturbance could lead to a high below-ground bud senescence. This is what I observed when I was counting the buds, that in the triennial and unburned treatments, I could see a high frequency of bud senescence, which could explain, or which could lead to mean that by excluding disturbance, you are actually killing the plants in one or the other. And then from the result of the 2 study sites, we could see that there seems to be some form of local effect. For example, maybe the difference in the soil properties between the 2 areas. So this local effect will form, or I'll try to look at, is this really what is going on during my next field sampling, where I'll collect soil samples so that we understand how does the soil properties differ between the two sites? And could this difference in soil properties be one of the main driving forces behind the different bud bank density that we are observing between the two sites and also between the two growth forms? Thank you.
Thank you, Tumi. You have run out of time, unfortunately. Thank you for a very interesting talk. And thanks to all the other speakers for quite interesting talks this afternoon. I would appreciate a round of applause to all of our talkers this afternoon. So we've come to the end of today's session. There's quite a few announcements, and if you could please maybe just spread the word for people that are not here at the moment. Firstly, if some of you are feeling rather tired and your muscles are aching, there is still the 12% discount that our AM Spa is giving to all the delegates if you spend over 250 Rand or more. Then just with regards to transportation for tonight, it is the same as last night, 6 p.m. The vehicles will be here to transport people to the dinner place, which is at the cricket club. Then once you're at the cricket club, this is just news with regards to the cash bar. There's 2 bars. So in order to alleviate some lines forming tonight,